everyone agrees with government's decision to halt the distribution of the AstraZeneca vaccine. The move by government comes after the COVID-19 vaccine was found to be less effective against a variant first identified in the country. But vaccinology professor Shabir Mahdi says this may potentially be a historic mistake. He joins us now to share his views. Professor Mahdi, good evening and thank you very much for your time tonight.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Can the nation conclude to say the decision to procure the AstraZeneca vaccine was flawed?
No, I think the decision to procure the vaccine was spot on. The government needed to act, and they needed to start engaging in bilaterals. Whereas South Africa would have found itself not getting access to any vaccine until the pandemic is probably over. So government needs to take the risk in terms of engaging in its bilaterals to get as much vaccine as possible into South Africa as quick as possible. So there was nothing wrong with government making that approach with AstraZeneca as well as with the other companies that it has started to open up bilateral discussions with. No one could have foreseen that the AstraZeneca vaccine wouldn't protect against mild infection. But that doesn't mean that this vaccine doesn't have any worth. In a country such as South Africa, where the variant that is circulating known as the B.1.351 variant dominates. And just to clarify, this is not my position. This is the position of the World Health Organization, when in the middle of February, the Scientific Advisory Group of Experts on Immunization, which advises the World Health Organization, came out and said that even in countries where the variant, the B.1.351 variant is circulating, those countries should continue using the AstraZeneca vaccine because there's a strong biological probability that a vaccine would still protect against severe disease.
Right.
Even if
I'm going to come to those potential benefits, but let's stay with this for a little longer, Prof. It seems government ended up with egg on its face because they had a whole arrival party, including the president and the deputy president, going to the airport to collect these vaccines, which turns out had an expiry date that was very closer than they had anticipated, and literally ending up being embarrassed by this. And it feels like they are wanting to distance themselves as far as possible from the AstraZeneca vaccine and the kind of scandal that it created.
Yeah, look, the issue of the expiry date is a completely separate issue, and certainly if due diligence was performed, we wouldn't have ended up receiving a vaccine that was going to expire in a period of about 3 months. When any biological is imported into the country, usually it's done by other companies, pharmaceutical companies, and that's part of the due diligence, that you actually see when is a product going to expire, and you plan in terms of when you're likely to be able to use the product. So the issue of importing a product which was going to expire within a space of 3 months, that unfortunately is a consequence of not adequate due diligence having been performed in terms of the actual contract with Serum Institute of India. Now, and that is to say government didn't know about it before it arrived.
Now, why are the other nations in the continent still procuring the AstraZeneca vaccine? Are they firstly assuming that they don't have the new strain, the strain that was discovered in South Africa, or are they have not done their test to ascertain whether they do have the strain, and they honestly believe that using the AstraZeneca vaccine would be effective?
Well, the problem in most of Southern Africa and the rest of Africa is that there isn't much sequencing done to be able to determine exactly the extent of circulation of the B.1.351 variant. But that being said, it's very likely that this variant currently dominates in the whole of Southern Africa. There was a small analysis done in Zambia as an example, where also they identified that more than 90% of the samples that were tested were due to this variant. So it's not an issue that the variant is not in other countries, but rather those countries seem to be more prepared to take their advice from the World Health Organization, which, as I mentioned, has said that even in those countries where the variant is circulating, those countries should still continue using the AstraZeneca vaccine because of the probability that it would protect against severe disease.
Okay, so what does it have to offer? I mean, cutting death and hospitalization rates, maybe a chance in the future of other virus mutations? I mean, what is the benefit that we get from it?
Yeah, so that's exactly, So this AstraZeneca vaccine is not a vaccine that you would be using in someone that's 20 or 30 years old that isn't at risk of developing severe disease. It would be a waste to actually use this particular generation of vaccine in that sort of demographic profile, because those individuals are not at risk of developing severe disease, and this vaccine is not going to protect against the sniffles. It's not going to protect against a runny nose or a sore throat. It's not going to protect against upper respiratory illness. But this vaccine is almost identical to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine in terms of the technology that's used to develop the vaccine, as well as the immune responses that are induced by this vaccine. They're almost identical. So if the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which was evaluated in a very different demographic profile, people that were sort of at heightened risk of developing severe disease, if that vaccine protects against severe disease, it's biologically difficult to explain why the AstraZeneca vaccine wouldn't do the same if evaluated in the same sort of population. The study in South Africa that we did on the AstraZeneca vaccine looked at the effectiveness of the vaccine in a young age group and against mild infection. There were no cases of severe disease in the study that we did. So we can't conclude that this vaccine doesn't protect against severe disease. And on the contrary, WHO, as I mentioned, strongly believe that the vaccine provides the best opportunity at this point in time for many countries to be able to protect against severe disease. And the reason for that is that AstraZeneca vaccine is a vaccine that's most widely available. It's the least costly of all of the vaccines. And that's the reason why we find millions of doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine currently being deployed through the COVAX facility through many African countries.
Now, can we use our position as far as the AstraZeneca experience is concerned to negotiate for a booster? And how soon would that be a possibility?
Yeah, and I think you raised an important point. So what we're faced with in South Africa currently is a toss-up between leaving people largely unprotected before the next resurgence is upon us, or taking a chance with the AstraZeneca vaccine, which, like I said, in a specific target group, people that are at high risk of developing severe disease might benefit. So the toss-up of leaving them completely unprotected or providing them some opportunity or some potential of benefiting before the resurgence is upon us. And that resurgence, I estimate, might well be around about May or June, or even earlier, depending what happens over the Easter period in terms of mass gatherings. Now, if the vaccine doesn't work, that's the worst. That's not a complete train smash, because if you've got another vaccine that becomes available a few months later, all you do is that's the same group that you've already targeted for vaccine, you top them up, you boost them with the other vaccine where there's greater certainty that it would work against the variant. So right now, we're pretty much facing a scenario where this vaccine that's going to expire at the end of April will probably end up expiring in the depots in South Africa rather than being put into the arms of people and providing them an opportunity to be protected, unless government has already got a buyer for a vaccine that is likely to that's supposed to expire by the end of April.
So we've got about 1 million of these in the country, if they haven't been bought already by some other country. Yet we are continuing with the massive trial. I mean, do you believe it's a trial or it's a rollout of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine?
Yeah, so the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is being administered as part of an effectiveness study. And there's nothing wrong with that, because it's important to gather more information in terms of how well this vaccine works. We know the vaccine is safe. And at the same time, there isn't any what we call a control group where people are not getting the vaccine. So this is sort of an implementation program, and it is necessary, and it was the best opportunity to be able to get the vaccine as quick as possible. So I think there's a number of factors that contributed to it being rolled out in the manner in which it is being rolled out, and I think it's important for it to be rolled out. Or else it's simply stated this 90,000 healthcare workers that have already been vaccinated, and an additional 300,000 that will likely be vaccinated in the course of the next few weeks simply wouldn't have been vaccinated. So the fact that it's an implementation study, which basically is trying to gather more information in terms of the effectiveness, for me is neither here nor there, because the alternative was largely to leave people unvaccinated, healthcare workers unvaccinated.
And, Prof, as far as the price question is concerned, I mean, you're saying AstraZeneca would have been the cheapest. Is Pfizer the most expensive to go for?
Well, the countries are able to negotiate for the companies and come up with different sort of pricing. So surprisingly, the Pfizer vaccine that was being offered to South Africa is actually priced lower per unit cost than was South Africa's contribution to the COVAX facilities. So South Africa was being offered a Pfizer vaccine at $10, but in a COVAX facility based on the amount government had to pay for a deposit for 10 million or for 6 million doses, it seems that we're paying $12 to $13 per dose in a COVAX facility, and we might end up getting a vaccine which, if we were to engage with the pharmaceutical companies, would have come in at a lower price. Now, there is a reason to participate in a COVAX facility in terms of showing social solidarity with other lower income countries. It's sort of a cross-subsidization model. But in terms of the benefit for South Africa, it's vital that it actually engages in bilaterals. And like I said, depending on the company, you can negotiate prices that are very different. So the Pfizer vaccine in the US is roughly about $25 to $30 per dose, and it was being offered to South Africa at $10 per dose, which is very similar to what a Johnson & Johnson vaccine would cost.
Professor Shabir Mahdi, I appreciate your time and thank you very much for joining us. That was Prof. Mahdi, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Witwatersrand and Director of the South African Medical Research Council Vaccines and Infectious Diseases Analytics Research Unit.